Business Cycles and Unemployment. Chapter 6. Business Cycles. The only reason that beginning macroeconomics would include the exploration of business cycles is to prepare the student to, most importantly, analysis of actual graphs. We'll begin with looking at the standard textbook business cycle graph shown to the right. Then we'll look at a graph from the World Bank to spot out a recession, expansion, and peak-to-peak business cycle. We'll close with the definition of a recession and takeaway from the exercise. So if we analyze the graph to the right, we have time as our x-axis and real GDP as our y-axis. We can see that the purple line is real GDP and it's fluctuating around the growth trend line. So we'll start with the easiest. What is a recession? Well, when you think of recession, you think of recede, which means to go back, or in this case, to go back down. And we start from a peak here, and we go all the way to a through. From peak to through, that is a recession. So what would we consider an expansion? Well, when it goes from the below point to the top, or from the true to the peak. We can see here this is the true and this is the peak, and it increases, and that's known as expansion. Now we say peak to peak is one business cycle, but is that how economists refer to the graphs when they're looking at an actual graph? Let's take a look at Japan's business cycles. We'll analyze its GDP. So we can see from this point to this point, high to low, Japan is going through a recession. And we see it again, high to low. Japan is going through a recession. Can you spot out an expansion? What we have here, Japan's economy is expanding, and here to here is another expansionary period. We also said that from peak to peak is a business cycle. So we have a peak here. This is a business cycle. And here's another business cycle. State a time period. So from 2010 to 2015, you could say, and we'll look here, this is 2010, and 2015 is over here. You would say that GDP decreased. So here's the question. Would you consider that a recession if you're going to be stating it in a paper? Well, take note that a recession is typically defined as decline in GDP for 2 or more consecutive quarters. And if we take a year, we know that a year has 4 quarters. So we have Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4. So if GDP decreases in quarter 1 and then again in quarter 2, that is a recession. So you could say it was a recessionary period. Economic growth can be caused by an increase in expenditure. Because economic growth, GDP, is equal to expenditure. GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. When any component of expenditure increases, GDP increases. Example 1. Net exports increase, which causes GDP to increase. Example 2. Government expenditure increases, which causes GDP to increase. When any component of expenditure decreases, GDP decreases. Government expenditure decreases, which causes GDP to decrease. Unemployment. When more and more people are losing their jobs, how do you think GDP changes? If someone you knew lost their job, what happens to the money they were spending? Their money, or stream of income, is gone, so you know they will be cutting back on their spending. Their becoming unemployed then decreases consumption, which decreases GDP. which looks like an increase in employment leads to a decrease in consumption, which leads to a decrease in GDP. If an entire group of individuals, say cashiers, are replaced with automated machines that take your orders, what happens to consumption? Consumption decreases. Shelves at Vons stay full, meaning inventories increase. So businesses cut back in production, which looks like an increase in unemployment leads to a decrease in consumption, leads to a decrease in investment, which ultimately leads to a decrease in GDP. Remember that GDP is equal to expenditure. And expenditure is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, which means that GDP and C plus I plus G plus NX are equal to each other. That's why when one component of expenditure changes, then we know that that caused a change in GDP. As you see here, I'm decreasing each one, and for each one I decrease of the component, I'm decreasing GDP as well. We know that when unemployment increases, which is bad because people lose their jobs, then what happens next is they start cutting back on consumption. Investments start decreasing as businesses cut production, and this ultimately leads to a decrease in GDP. Your job is to know what the unemployment rate means, so you could put it in your paper. So we'll analyze a 2014 story from BBC. So here we read, the jobless rate in Greece reached a record high of 28% in November, according to newly released government figures. So unemployment reached an all-time high. Remember, that means people lose their jobs. And when people lose their jobs, they cut back on consumption. When consumption cuts back and people are spending less, then businesses decrease investments as they cut back production. This will ultimately lead to a decrease in GDP. We go on to read, for those under the age of 25, the unemployment hit 61%. This can indicate that from people who are coming out of college are having a difficult time finding jobs. So what types of unemployment are there? There's frictional, which means in between jobs, or transitional. There's structural, due to technological advances and educational deficiencies. And there's cyclical, caused by business cycles. Frictional unemployment. Has there ever been a time in your life when you were in between jobs? Maybe there was some friction in the workplace, and now you're searching for a new firm to be a part of. In any case, you still have the marketable skill set of experience as well as education, so you're still marketable. Take Mr. James Comey, the former FBI director, who has past work experience in the private sector as general counsel and senior vice president for Lockheed Martin, and his education from the University of Chicago Law School. Mr. Comey has the requisite skill set to competently secure another position. Moreover, his unemployment is only frictional, transitional, because he is marketable. Now, if you were watching the Comey testimony, then you saw when Mr. Comey said that he was in between jobs. We can read here Mr. Comey saying, "I'm in between opportunities right now." Comey interrupted, prompting Harris and others to laugh. She responds, "I'm sure you'll have decent opportunities in the future." This is a perfect example of frictional unemployment. Comey is in between opportunities, in between jobs. Structural unemployment. The biggest driving factor to structural unemployment is technology. Take a look at the background picture. Where are the human cashiers? They have all been replaced with machines, technology. The same thing is expected to happen to airline ticket and baggage positions. What are these machines doing to low-skilled workers? They're making them uncompetitive and, more importantly, exposing low-skilled workers of their lack of education. As technology advances, it creates a mismatch in skill set and education and pushes a whole class of people to increase their skill sets and or education. So lastly, cyclical unemployment. When GDP decreases, following the ups and downs of business cycles, this causes cyclical unemployment, unemployment from business cycles, such as a recession. From that point to that point in GDP, we know that as GDP decreases, it translates to an increase in unemployment, which is part of cyclical unemployment. So here's an example. Greece's unemployment rate increased from January to February to reach 28%. So here's a hypothetical example. Greece's unemployment rate increased from January to February to reach 28%. As more people lose their jobs, they consume less, and investments fall, as business respond by cutting production. GDP decreases from the time period as shown by the graph below from BBC. And so here we have GDP decreasing from the time that we stated, January to February.
Trough.